Previously, I talked about American surveillance efforts going back all the way to World War I. I mentioned that Edward Snowden leaked highly classified documents, so this episode will focus on the information he shared with the public, provoking an initial outrage that was followed by mainly silence. In early 2013, after having worked for Dell, the CIA, various contractors, and the NSA itself, Snowden contacted journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. He handed over various files detailing American and Allied surveillance programs. He claimed that in previous years he had become disillusioned, seeing that these programs were not only directed against hostile organizations and states, but also allies and ordinary citizens. Since he had worked as an analyst and an administrator, he had access to lots of classified documents, through which he was able to get a clearer picture of the NSA's clandestine activities. Here I will run through the list of such programs, along with their alleged goals. The first major program that was leaked was PRISM, which allows access to American citizens' Yahoo and Google accounts with a court's approval. It seems that these companies were paid in order to provide secret access to their online databases, but telecom providers like Verizon were also included. They handed over millions of phone records every day due to a secret court order. The black budget for the 16 spy agencies reached $52 billion in 2013. This covered the cost, but they also harvested contact lists, email contents, located and tracked millions of cell phones, prevented encryption, pinpointed surveillance targets, and accessed communication networks. Apparently, this was not enough. The NSA and others spied on players of Second Life, World of Warcraft, and Xbox Live. They tracked the online sex life of certain individuals, like their own love interests, but also conducted industrial espionage against companies like Petrobras. Among the targets were UNICEF, EU politicians, and even state leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu and Angela Merkel. According to Snowden, the analytical tool XKeyscore could collect almost anything on the internet. Members of the Five Eyes Alliance, Britain's GCHQ, Canada's CSEC, Australia's ASD, and New Zealand's GCSB were also active in these programs. The main target in Europe was Germany, although that country's own agency had also cooperated, along with their Dutch, French, and Swedish counterparts. Members of Five Eyes were supposedly exempted, but we cannot be sure of that. Similarly, American citizens were supposedly excluded, but it's likely that allied agencies like the GCHQ performed the task of monitoring their activities, avoiding legal issues. In October 2013, it was revealed that the US had spied on Brazil, Britain, France, China, Germany, and Spain, along with 35 world leaders and 122 high-ranking leaders. Continuous expansion was planned, which is not surprising, as every organization wants to grow and grab more power. In January 2014, Snowden claimed that besides national security aspects, industrial espionage was also conducted, for example against Siemens, which German authorities soon refuted as nonsense. 2 months later, a new leak suggested that the USA and the GCHQ planned to infest millions of computers with malware using a program called Turbine. Another project, Quantum Hand, aimed the creation of a fake Facebook server to hijack traffic. Another allegation by Snowden was that 90% of the targets were ordinary American citizens, not the originally intended individuals and organizations. What's more, the automation of cyber warfare was in the works, which would immediately detect an incoming attack and even respond in kind. This was a problem, as identifying the real source of such an attack cannot be guaranteed, so the wrong country could be hit by the response. Besides these programs, Many others had been in active use for years. With Upscale, they gained access to undersea cables and collected data on several continents, monitoring phone calls, emails, websites, and other forms of electronic communication, spying on ordinary citizens, but also the UN in New York and the European Commission in Brussels. They did this in close cooperation with several Western governments, capturing data before encryption, so even supposedly safe channels did not provide any protection. The GCHQ provided help in such efforts, analyzing nearly the entire European internet traffic. At the same time, Singapore and Australia listened to such traffic in the Pacific region. As I mentioned in the video on American surveillance efforts, tapping major communications networks had been going on for a full century, but cooperation with providers of global communication had started in the 1970s. Certain companies were paid substantial sums for their efforts, others were coerced into cooperation. Funds came from the NSA that paid its British partner, exploiting weaker British legislation that allowed expanded spying activities. This, in turn, made it possible for the USA to search the emails and phone calls of millions of US citizens without a warrant. Surveillance guidelines on domestic spying had not been updated for decades, but they were disregarded anyway. In 2011, the Obama administration reversed certain restrictions on the use of intercepted communications. A warrant for each target was no longer required, so Americans' communications could be picked up without a probable cause. This way, the NSA could map the social connections of each citizen, along with their locations and other personal information. The smartphone boom was exploited, a task force was set up for each major mobile operating system to study and crack them. At the same time, computer specialists infiltrated various foreign networks using remotely transmitted malware, which could take over these networks should the need arise. One example was the anonymity network Tor, some of whose users were diverted to unsecure channels. In certain cases, the hardware itself was modified, intercepting shipments of major manufacturers, adding custom modules to the devices. Fake encryption certificates were issued, impersonating Google and other companies. Powerful quantum computers were being researched to break all existing types of encryption. Passengers who showed up at Canadian airports and used their free Wi-Fi were tracked through other public Wi-Fi networks they later connected to. WikiLeaks and other anti-secrecy organizations were specifically targeted, but the NSA's tools were also used in drone strikes. The State Room program included the interception of radio, telecommunications, and internet traffic using the diplomatic missions of the Five Eyes. It provided information to the Special Collection Service, a top-secret surveillance group that was based in dozens of US embassies and consulates. At the time, roughly 75% of US internet traffic was reached, gathering information on suspects and even listening in on Americans who mentioned foreigners under surveillance. Court orders were routinely violated, and not by mistake. Information was withheld from Congress for months before important voting sessions. The outrage of foreign governments in France, Germany, etc. was mostly fake, as they had known about these programs for months, even years. What's more, they had been handing over detailed information on their own citizens on a regular basis. The fact that diplomatic missions were used for spying is not particularly surprising, since this is what every single state had been doing for centuries. Websites like LinkedIn and organizations like OPEC were obvious targets, but even prestigious hotels were monitored through their reservation systems and fax machines. At the time, the spread of 3G networks provided new opportunities. Naturally, each nation tried to protect its own networks and attack that of others. Another great example is Britain's Muscular program, which allowed the NSA and the GCHQ to tap the main communication links between Yahoo's and Google's data centers, siphoning information from their systems. The GCHQ also collected still images of webcam conversations, recording people showing their private body parts. This concludes my brief summary on global surveillance. We can be sure that such efforts continue today, perhaps on a much larger scale, but the public does not seem to care, which suggests that people prefer security to freedom. Democracies all over the world are increasingly spying on their own citizens and impose more restrictions on liberties. We'll see where this will lead in the coming years.